Have you ever wanted to camp from your bed with two earbuds plugged into your head? It's the summer of 2020 and we've built a pixel pyre, so let's tell ghost stories around a digital fire. It's the least haunted campfire club. It's least haunted campfire club. So pull up a log made of pillows and towels and turn down the lights while we unhook our jowls. Make this full screen or else go in blind. Either way you'll see creatures in the flames or your mind.
He was the last of his kind, a hair-covered, 10-foot-tall humanoid with a large mouth and peg-like teeth. His hair, although it was more accurately fur, was a ruddy brown and coarse. Patches of pale green lichen grew on the parts where limbs converged and dank sweat accumulated. A heavy brow sloped forward from a high-peaked skull to hang ledge-like over large, expressive brown eyes. He looked less like a living creature, and more like what someone with bone and stone tools would have carved out of a tree trunk. His feet were large, but in proportion to his size. He trundled along beneath the redwood trees, which, if he were to stand perfectly still, he would disappear into, the swinging of his long arms providing a strange counterweight that helped propel him along. Like the pendulums of a large clock, they kept time and pace, 5 seconds and 6 feet every time a hand brushed past a knee. Most of his time was spent slowly moving through the forest, ruminating on his position as the last of his kind. Once there were dozens like him. Dozens, but only in this part of the world. He knew there were others like him elsewhere, in places that were drier, higher, and more rocky. Like him, but not entirely like him. In the way that camels in the Sahara are like two humped Bactrians, and how they were in turn like llamas. Most of these differences came down to geography, but many of them came down to simple belief. He began his existence thousands of years ago, when the first humans to wander into this forest began to settle in and make the region into a semi-regular dwelling place. These people took in their surroundings of giant trees, mossy rocks, rivers and streams, and the various animal life, and they thought to themselves, this place is special, and of course there is some sort of being who tends to it. And with that first thought, he stepped out of the base of a redwood tree and into his domain. He soon discovered he was not alone. There were others, and they all looked generally the same with slight variations, due mostly to being created by the different tribes of the area, but close enough that one seeing them could not deny that they were all of a kind. They resembled the wooden portraits that the humans had begun carving in their new villages. The next few thousand years were fairly uneventful. They went about their business, moving through the forest, leaving no trace of themselves but their relatively large footprints, disappearing seamlessly into the trees when a human approached, which he often thought was a bit of an odd behavior. After all, the humans had created him with their belief, so they knew that he existed. But the humans had also decided that as a being of a supernatural nature, he should never be seen, even though they knew what he and his kind looked like, had given them form from carved wooden logs. He and his kind habitually hid because that's just what you do. Eventually new people entered the area. Humans who viewed the forest as something that needed to be conquered, tamed, and also feared. To them it was a wild and unholy place, only fit for harvesting what usefulness they could devise with their minds of cogs and gears. These new people also feared and despised the older people, who still called this land home. The newcomers viewed the beliefs of these first peoples as evil devil worship, and added it to the list of things to be conquered and feared. It was around this time that the other kind made its first appearance. Whereas he and his kind were gentle giants in the forest given anthropomorphic form, the other kind were all the worst bits of nature twisted and shaped by fearful, hateful minds into a vaguely human bestial form. These were creatures of raw impulse and instinct. They represented all the dangers that these newly arrived humans knew lurked in the pagan wilderness, the spirits that heathens worshipped and sacrificed to in the dark. Needless to say, his kind and the other kind did not get along well. As large trees crashed and were burned in the fires of progress, and human cultures and beliefs clashed, so too did the two kinds regard each other. For a start, the other kind ate flesh. This ran contrary to the older kind's vegetarian nature as guardians of the forest. Secondly, they were just impossible to talk to. This, of course, led to a few skirmishes. The older kind had begun to dwindle at this time as well. As their creators were driven and erased from the land, the belief that had given his kind their form ebbed and flowed away. The new kind proliferated and soon outnumbered their predecessors, but even that was short-lived. Even their violence and tenacity meant nothing in the changing minds of the men that had given them form. Eventually both kinds nearly vanished. He still encountered a few of the other kind occasionally as he ambled about, but whatever animosity they once had for each other had long since faded into the tingling numbness of time and commiseration. Although they were of different kinds, they were both in the same metaphorical boat now. In the past, what would have been a violent confrontation of large tree branch clubs and thrown stones was these days just a sad shared glance. And that is the way it went for the next 100 years or so, until all of the new kinds arrived. It was the 1950s when it happened. He was taking a rest on the banks of a rocky creek somewhere in the vicinity of the Klamath River when he was surprised to see a large hairy humanoid come strutting out of the trees on two of the largest feet he had ever seen. It looked like one of the other kind, but somehow tamer? If that was the right word for a 10-foot-tall giant hair-covered creature. It was a lighter color, too. The other kind had been black-haired with blood-red eyes. This new kind was a brown-gray with black pits for eyes, and it appeared as what he could only describe as blurry? He blinked to try and focus his eyes. He tried to greet it by raising his arm and giving a call. The new kind looked at him with its dark pool-like eyes and without a word turned around and hastily walked back the way it came, its arms swinging rapidly. Whereas his arms moved like slow clock pendulums, this newcomer was a clock that had been wound much too tight. When it was halfway from the tree line, it turned at the waist to look back at him, but it never stopped walking. Soon he lost sight of it. That was weird, he thought. It wasn't the last encounter he would have with the new kind. In fact, it seemed that they were proliferating. He also soon learned that they had a name. His kind had had a name once. They had many, in fact. But the one that most remembered had been Sasquatch. This new kind, however, had a name that aptly described their most notable shared characteristic, albeit the name wasn't the most creative, but that's humans for you. The new kind were called Bigfoot. Now, more than 60 years later, the Big Feet were numerous, but whereas the old kind had always been fairly uniform in their forms, the Big Feet had hundreds of different variations. The only thing in common was the giant feet, and even those didn't always match. He had once come across one that had 11 toes. Another time he saw one whose feet looked like two flat pieces of plywood. The Big Feet came in all colors, provided that those colors were shades of brown, red, black, or gray, although there was one out there that seemed to glow with a green light at night, and there was another one that beeped almost mechanically. Even a few of the other kind had reappeared back into the mix. Once in a remote wooded and rocky canyon in the Trinity Alps, he encountered a 15-foot-tall orangutan, which confused him because he had no idea what an orangutan was. Yet he was still the last of his kind, a creature born out of the minds of men and the trunks of trees. He found that he could not relate to any of the new kind, the Big Feet. Half of them were so badly out of focus that even he, who could vanish from sight in an instant, had a hard time finding them. And talking to them? Forget it. He once tried talking with a Bigfoot that was picking flowers in a meadow. It was about 8 feet tall, in a reddish color. "Hello there," he said. "I bring you love," the Bigfoot said. "Pardon?" he asked. "I bring you love," the Bigfoot repeated. "And peace." And then it made a confused face, as if it was trying to read the next line from a script that only it could see. "Also, understanding," it grinned at a job well done. He let his shoulders sag a bit in disappointment, let out a sigh, and said, "That's okay. I think I'm all good, actually." And he turned to walk away. As he was making his way out of the meadow, the Bigfoot waved a handful of wildflowers and called after him, "If you're ready for peace and love, just come find me. We can end all war. Just follow my gentle giant ways." Then there was that extreme Bigfoot that roamed around the forest doing stunts and eating beef jerky. It was enough to make him lose hope. Currently, he was leaning against a lone redwood tree on a rocky outcropping high up on the top of a hill somewhere near the coast. It was nighttime. Far below him, he could hear all the various cries, calls, and howls of the various big feet as they darted in and out of flashlight beams, ducked out of the way of trail cameras, and piled up logs in bizarre and pointless configurations. They had inherited the habit of being unseen. Well, almost unseen. With the old kind, it was a matter of spiritual belief that made them hard to see. It was veneration. They were hard to see because the people believed they were hard to see. But now, the people only believed because they were hard to see. It was all rather maddening. So now Big Feet went out of their way to be partially seen and to leave just enough evidence to keep the belief going. He pondered sadly. Maybe if we had acted like jackasses, there would be more of us too. He leaned back against the tree and finally faded into the trunk.
Ours is a world of words. Quiet we call silence, which is the merest word of all. Al-Araf. "Listen to me," said the demon, as he placed his hand upon my head. "There is a spot upon this accursed earth which thou hast never yet beheld, and if by any chance thou hast beheld it, it must have been in one of those vigorous dreams which come like the simoon upon the brain of the sleeper who hath lain down to sleep among the forbidden sunbeams. Among the sunbeams, I say, which slide from off the solemn columns of the melancholy temples in the wilderness. The region of which I speak is a dreary region in Libya, by the border of the river Zaire, and there is no quiet there, nor silence. The waters of the river have a saffron and sticky hue, and they flow not onward to the sea, but palpitate forever and forever beneath the red eye of the sun with a tumultuous and convulsive motion. For many miles on either side of the river's oozy bed is a pale desert of gigantic water lilies. They sigh one unto the other in that solitude, and stretch toward the heaven their long ghastly necks, and nod to and fro their everlasting heads. And there is an indistinct murmur which cometh out from among them like the rushing of subterrene water, and they sigh one unto the other. But there is a boundary to their realm, the boundary of the dark, horrible, lofty forest. There, like the waves about the Hebrides, the slow underwood is agitated continually, but there is no wind throughout the heaven. The tall primeval trees rock eternally hither and thither with a crashing and mighty sound, and from their high summits, one by one, drop everlasting dews. And at the roots strange poisonous flowers lie writhing in perturbed slumber. And overhead, with a rustling and loud noise, the gray clouds rush westwardly, forever until they roll, a cataract over the fiery wall of the horizon. But there is no wind throughout the heaven, and by the shores of the river Zaire there is neither quiet nor silence. It was night, and then the rain fell, and, falling, it was rain, but, having fallen, it was blood. And I stood in the morass among the tall lilies, and the rain fell upon my head, and the lilies sighed one into the other in the solemnity of their desolation. And all at once the moon arose through the thin ghastly mist, and was crimson in color, and mine eyes fell upon a huge gray rock which stood by the shore of the river, and was litten by the light of the moon. And the rock was gray and ghastly and tall, and the rock was gray. Upon its front were characters engraven in the stone, and I walked through the morass of water lilies until I came close to the shore, that I might read the characters upon the stone. But I could not decipher the characters, and I was going back into the morass when the moon shone with a fuller red, and I turned and looked again upon the rock and upon the characters, and the characters were desolation. And I looked upward, and there stood a man upon the summit of the rock, and I hid myself among the water lilies, that I might discover the actions of the man. And the man was tall and stately in form, and was wrapped up from his shoulders to his feet in the toga of old Rome. And the outlines of his figure were distinct, but his features were the features of a deity. For the mantle of the night, and of the mist, and of the moon, and of the dew had left uncovered the features of his face. And his brow was lofty with thought, and his eyes wild with care. And in the few furrows upon his cheek I read the fables of sorrow, and weariness, and disgust with mankind, and a longing after solitude. And the moon shone upon his face, and upon the features of his face, and oh, they were more beautiful than the airy dreams which hover about the souls of the daughters of Delos. And the man sat down upon the rock, and leaned his head upon his hand, and looked out upon the desolation. He looked down into the low, unquiet shrubbery, and up into the tall primeval trees, and up higher at the rustling heaven, and into the crimson moon. And I lay close with the shelter of the lilies, and observed the actions of the man. And the man trembled in the solitude, but the night waned, and sat upon the rock. And the man turned his attention from the heaven, and looked out upon the dreary river Zaire, and upon the yellow ghastly waters, and upon the pale legions of the water lilies. And the man listened to the sighs of the water lilies, and the murmur that came up from among them. And I lay close within my covert, and observed actions of the man. And the man trembled in the solitude, but the night waned, and he sat upon the rock. And I went down to the recesses of the morass, and waded afar in among the wilderness of the water lilies, and called unto the hippopotami, which dwelt among the fens and the recesses of the morass. And the hippopotami heard my call, and came with... And the hippopotami heard my call, and came with the behemoth unto the foot of the rock, and roared loudly and fearfully beneath the moon. And I lay close within my covert, and observed the actions of the man, and the man trembled in the solitude. But the night waned, and he sat upon the rock. Then I cursed the elements with the curse of tumult, and a frightful tempest gathered in the heaven, where before there had been no wind. And the heaven became livid with the violence of the tempest, and the rain beat upon the head of the man. And the floods of the river came down, the river was tormented in foam, and the water lilies shrieked within their beds, and the forest crumbled before the wind, and the thunder rolled, and the lightning fell, and the rock rocked to its foundation. I lay close within my covert, and observed the actions of the man, and the man trembled in the solitude. But the night waned, and he sat upon the rock. Then I grew angry and cursed with the curse of the silence, the river, the lilies, and the wind, and the forest, and heaven, the thunder, and the sigh of the water lilies. And they became accursed and were still. And the moon ceased to totter in its pathway up in heaven, and the thunder died away, and the lightning did not flash, and the clouds hung motionless, and the waters sunk to their levels and remained. And the trees ceased to rock, and the water lilies sighed no more, and the murmur was heard no longer from among them, nor any shadows of sound throughout the vast illuminated desert. And I looked upon the characters of the rock, and they were changed, and the characters were silence. And mine eyes fell upon the countenance of the man, and his countenance was wan with terror. And hurriedly he raised his head from his hand, and stood forth upon the rock, and listened. But there was no voice throughout the vast illimitable desert, and the characters upon the rock were silence. And the man shuddered, and turned his face away, and fled afar off, and I beheld him no more. Now there are fine tales in the volumes of the Magi, in the iron-bound melancholy volumes of the Magi. Therein, I say, are glorious histories of the heaven, and of the earth, and of the mighty sea, and of the genii that overruled the sea, and the earth, and the lofty heavens. There was much lore, too, in the sayings which were said by the Sibyls, and holy, holy things that were heard of old by the dim leaves that trembled around the Dodona. But as Allah liveth, that fable which the demon told me as he sat by my side in the shadow of the tomb, I hold to be the most wonderful of all. And as the demon made an end to his story, he fell back within the cavity of the tomb, and laughed. And I could not laugh with the demon, and he cursed me because I could not laugh. And the lynx which dwelt forever in the tomb came out of the tomb and lay down at the feet of the demon, and looked at him steadily in the face. That was Silence by, you might have guessed, Edgar Allan Poe, published in 1838.
It was the least haunted campfire club. The least haunted campfire club. The least haunted campfire club YouTube show.